Hello and welcome to the Finance Quarter. I'm Andrew Robertson. On the program today, how a shareholder agreement can stop that small business dream turning into a nightmare, and will the reforms to the financial planning industry make us better off? Even the industry itself is divided. But first today, self-managed superannuation. It's the fastest growing sector of an industry that's now worth well over $1 trillion. Self-managed super is now a big industry in its own right, accounting for over 1/3 of that huge pile of money. It's now so large that many experts worry that any serious hiccup with self-managed super could be a threat to the whole economy. As leaders of the superannuation industry gathered in Sydney, the man who conducted the government's review of their sector was there to listen. But the Association of Superannuation Funds of Australia is concerned that the Cooper Review's focus was primarily on the large regulated funds and not self-managed super.
There is $1.1 trillion. 2/3 are regulated, 1/3 is not regulated, and we must make sure that the levers across the whole of the $1.1 trillion drive those public policy outcomes.
Self-managed superannuation is now the biggest segment of the super industry. There are nearly 500,000 funds with a total balance of just under $400 billion. Pauline Varmos says because of its size, the risks involved with self-managed super now have implications for the whole economy.
If you've got that level of risk being borne by people who now manage 1/3 of the retirement income system, do we have a risk here that is tolerable?
The risks around self-managed super have been highlighted again in the collapse of Trio Capital, where there are now calls for a compensation fund to be established along the lines of the one already in existence for big regulated funds. Pauline Varmos, who represents those big funds, thinks a better way of providing a safety net, though, for self-managed super is to compel them to take a different approach to investing.
I think one of the ways we can get a safety net is either start looking at a minimum before you move into a self-managed fund. Another way is to look at mandatory diversification, and it might be 2, 3 or 4. So if one of the assets fall or one of the product providers fall, there is some sort of safety net there.
Housing is a key asset in many self-managed superannuation funds, and the Ask for Lunch heard a warning about the dangers contained in Australia's currently overheated housing market. John Coombe from Yana Investment Advisors believes the market should be given time to naturally correct itself.
If we muck around with it, or if policymakers muck around in the market, we could cause a big problem for our banking sector and therefore our economy. We are very fortunate that we haven't pricked that bubble to any extent and caused problems within the domestic economy.
Of course, nobody is seriously suggesting the self-managed super sector is set to implode. It's just that it's so big now that the risks involved need to be closely monitored. A more immediate risk to the economy, as was mentioned in that report, comes from the housing market. According to research house Fujitsu, up to 25% of homeowners are now really feeling the pinch from rising interest rates, which is why retail sales are so depressed. And Fujitsu believes any further rises in rates will have a big impact.
For many people, that will be pretty much the end of the road in terms of being able to spend any discretionary spending whatsoever. So we're putting more on credit cards, cutting back on discretionary spending, trying to keep the mortgage repayments going. I think we'll probably see, and we're seeing a little bit of evidence of this, that in some areas people are already thinking about should they sell, because essentially they may not be able to afford to continue to make their mortgage repayments. If rates do go up, I wouldn't be surprised to see a little bit of further selling in some postcodes. Not all postcodes, but some, southwestern Sydney, for example, on the Gold Coast, for example, could have an impact then in terms of the broader economy because of the multiplier effect of those people.
Small business is the backbone of the Australian economy. But for many small business owners, what starts out as a dream can turn into a nightmare as they find themselves locked in battle with fellow shareholders who have a different idea on how the business should be run. It's a situation that can fracture families and bring an end to lifelong friendships. A shareholder agreement drawn up when the business has started can go a long way towards heading off that conflict. Andrew, you're the principal of Argyle Lawyers in Sydney and you've drawn up many shareholder agreements. What are they and why are they needed if you're going to start a business?
In simple terms, shareholders by majority appoint the board by majority makes decisions. Within that construct, there is a good and sound basis, but it doesn't apply to all companies appropriately, particularly for small companies where you might have significant shareholders who don't want to just be passive, who have associates who want to be on the board or be part of the executive, or significant shareholders who may have related transaction interests that they want to have covered within the company. In those circumstances, it is important for particularly the minority shareholders to clearly have a guideline through which to protect themselves and their shareholding.
What should a shareholder agreement cover?
Shareholder agreements can cover a myriad of things, and it comes down to the importance that the shareholders place towards different matters as to what is covered and what isn't covered. Typically, the kind of matters that are covered, if I'm a 40% shareholder in a company, I might say I want to have equal representation on the board so that I've got a voice in how the company is being run. I might have veto rights on what is decided by the board as opposed to what is decided by the shareholders. I might change the special resolution threshold so that I've got a voice. In other words, I'm moulding it to something that is fair to me, notwithstanding what my percentage is.
What if you're planning to start a business with a close relative or a really good friend who you may have known for, say, 20, 30 years? You've never had an argument in your life. You trust them implicitly. Why do you need a shareholder agreement?
That's a good point. That comes down to the individuals and how the individuals view moving from a friendship or a family relationship to a business relationship. I've been witness to going on holidays with friends, and the friends turn out to be very different on holidays to what I was experiencing then during social engagements. The same can apply to business. I think it's always good to set off the business on the right foot to make sure the business is very separate to the personal relationship or the family relationship, and really say, hey, this is business. We're talking about putting in money in. We're talking about spending a lot of time, effort and anguish on this animal. Let's do it and do it correctly.
What I thought I heard you saying between the lines then is that the pressures of business and money can change a relationship.
Very much. I agree.
What are some of the cases you've seen where people have been badly hurt because they didn't have a shareholder agreement?
There was a particular example of a company that was run for about 20 years. The same shareholders were involved. The sales director questioned the managing director's spend, travel expenses and entertainment expenses. For his troubles, the managing director made sure that the sales director was removed from his position. The managing director probably assumed at that stage that because the shareholding had been so stable, he had no trouble with shoring up his position. What the sales director, or the former sales director, did, though, was he lobbied some of the shareholders and found two that were willing to listen to him. One agreed to sell their shares. They'd been involved with the company for quite an extended period of time, sold the shares to the former sales director without disclosing it to the others, and he aligned himself with another shareholder. They had 54%. Having the majority of the shares, they could then vote the directors on or off, which they did, and the managing director lost his position.
And I guess there are unforeseen circumstances where you may start a business with a friend or relative, and then that friend or relative dies, and you suddenly find yourself in business with that friend or relative's spouse, who may have a very different view of the world to you, and what was a very smooth relationship suddenly becomes a very rocky one.
That's true. A shareholders agreement can provision for that, so that there is a forced sale on the death or divorce or incapacity or insolvency of one of the shareholders, so that the other shareholder can be protected from those circumstances. There is also the ability to put insurance policies over, so if someone dies and the other party's got the funding to buy out the deceased person's shares. There's a number of different mechanisms that can be applied, but again it gets down to look at the individual company, look at the individual circumstances, and then try and address those through a contract.
So in summary, if you're starting a business, your view would be that a shareholder agreement is the best way of ensuring your best interests in that business?
Certainly, I think that it behoves everybody to ensure that they clearly understand what they're getting into, what the terms are, and to consider the what-ifs. What if we don't get on? What if there is a problem with the way the business moves forward? And it's part of the portfolio of what needs to be considered when establishing and setting up a business to set off in the right path.
Andrew Ireland, a lot to think about there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
As I'm sure you've heard, the federal government has released its final proposals for reforming the financial planning industry. They're controversial and they've split the industry, particularly the proposal to expand single-issue advice in areas such as insurance. For example, MLC boss Steve Tucker believes they're a good first step to persuading more people to get financial advice.
There's 80% of Australians out there who don't get access to advice for various reasons. Some would be they simply don't know where to go. Others would be that they have simple needs and they don't need to go through the full sophisticated process. We need to get to those clients, show them the value of advice, whether it be simple or single issue advice in the first instance, and then encourage them to go through the more fulsome process over time.
The Association of Financial Advisors, which represents about 7,000 financial planners, has a different view though. It believes the government is laying the foundations for a very complicated advice industry.
And I think what that'll end up is that there'll be two tiers of advice. The preserve of the better off in the community that can get holistic advice, have the professional relationship on the one hand, and on the other hand you'll have people that are getting light advice, not too dissimilar from the direct offers that we get from institutions around topping up our credit card limits and so on. That's not advice, that can well become product sell, and we have concerns about that.
Well, that's all for this edition of the Finance Quarter. If you'd like to see any part of the program again, you can find us on the ABC News website. Just go to the business page and click on the Finance Quarter icon. And if you'd like to write to us about anything to do with money or business, our email address is thefinancequarter@your.abc.net.au. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on the Finance Quarter.